Greetings, Zero and Repeater Books readers. Today, we're joined by two members of one of the most promising groups in the British left today, AngryWorkers, to discuss their latest book, Thick of It All, Work, Inquiry, and Struggle in the NHS. As someone involved with various struggles in the UK, I've known about AngryWorkers for many years now. However, I first had the opportunity to engage with their work back in 2020 when I was commissioned by another group I was a member of to write a review of their previous book, Class Power on 0 Hours. That book documents the experiences of members of AngryWorkers who had infiltrated a number of warehouses in London to try and encourage the autonomous self-organization of the workers there. If our listeners haven't had the chance to read it yet, I can't recommend Class Power on 0 Hours enough. Shortly afterwards, AngryWorkers moved into the NHS. For our listeners abroad who might not know, the NHS, or the National Health Service, is the single largest employer in the UK. So this was in many ways the ideal target for AngryWorkers' intervention. Their new book, written with contributions from comrades in the anarchist communist group, the Communist Workers' Organization, and others, most fundamentally tries to understand what the NHS is from an organizer perspective, what possibilities there are for organizing anti-capitalist resistance within it, and also what an alternative healthcare system could look like. Marco and Giles, thank you very much for joining us today.
Hi.
Thanks for having us.
Well, to start us off with, would you mind telling our listeners a little bit about AngryWorkers, its history, how it came into existence, and why you chose this specific approach to organizing rather than another?
Marco's probably best to speak to the kind of early days, because I guess there's a couple of kind of time periods that might not be obvious to readers about the group and what's happened. So I'll let Marco speak for the first bit.
Yeah, I think AngryWorkers is a very small collective, let's be honest. It's like, 5 to 10, 15, maybe 20 people in the orbit. And I think what maybe distinguishes us is that, we feel that self-organization of workers at work on a daily level is in itself, has got a political content, meaning the experience of not just working together, often in a quite hierarchical system, but also being able to use this cooperation in our own interest as a class has got political implications. So rather than saying we've got an organizational model, either the union or the party, we start from that premise that in the daily experience of the worker, organization is formed. That doesn't mean that there's no history, there's not revolutionary history, there are no lessons. Of course there are, but at the same time we have to understand this very specific experience again and again. And that's what we're trying at the moment, mainly through interviews, but also by working in places ourselves, which doesn't feel, or it feels less like an infiltration, more like, we needed, like everyone else, to pay bills. And we try to discuss more or less collectively, like where that could be and where it would be more like some political. And at the moment that for some of us, that was in health. Okay, that was like a very roundabout answer. Charles, you want to add something?
I guess there's a couple of, like I said, a couple of kind of time periods about like how AngryWorkers evolved. So I guess there was a kind of project in West London that was led up to kind of, I think, late 2019, early 2020, which I wasn't involved with at all, but was aware of. And partly inspired by that, as well as a few other projects, some of us in Leeds were doing kind of organizing around where we live, solidarity network stuff. And then Marco and Kieran and some of the other AngryWorkers kind of put out a wider call to kind of people that they'd come into contact with that had expressed kind of similar political views to kind of expand the group or create a kind of wider collective across the country that was interested in working in this kind of way. And that's when I kind of came into the orbit a little bit and got involved. That unfortunately kind of one of the ways of catalyzing that was do a lot of book tours and book speaking stuff around the kind of Class Power book. But that unfortunately kind of coincided with the beginning of the pandemic at the beginning of 2020. So a lot of those book speaking stuff didn't happen. So I guess we had a couple of years of kind of this group kind of being a little bit virtual online. And in that process, like Marco said, a couple of other people I was already working in NHS, a couple of other people started working in NHS as well. And so the obvious kind of thing to do then was to think about the kind of political task of organising as workers in the NHS. And that's a little bit where the book then came from.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mentioned a moment ago that, again, like you have this other book out, Class Power on 0 Hours. I think it's a fantastic book. And although the experiences it documents involve like quite a few uphill struggles, the work you all did for it is something I think we should all be engaging with. I'd like to know, however, if you think there is any continuity between that book and your new one. For instance, Class Power on 0 Hours ends with a bunch of lessons that you had all learned as organizers. Have those lessons been of much use in the healthcare setting? Have your new experiences contradicted any of those lessons? And why did you choose to move into the NHS, I guess, as an organization in the first place? I know you said that you yourself were already in there.
I don't know, lessons learned. I'm not sure. I don't know if there's a continuity, to be honest, as such. I think the book, the Sick of It All book, was more like a collection of something that we could call like a pre-inquiry. So, we were asked to just, put up texts with experiences within the NHS, and that's what we did. So it was probably less of a product of an already existing collective practice. It was more like, okay, we have some comrades in the sector. Let's politicize that. Let's start talking about it, because lots of kind of, lefties work in the NHS or like in care in general. But there doesn't seem to be like too much of a debate. Individually people organize themselves somehow, some in unions and some in affinity groups, but there doesn't seem to be like a proper discussion. And I think it was just the first step of bringing in some material and hoping to, get some discussion going. So I think it's just really the starting point or something. And Class Power was more like a summary of a collective experience. So in that sense, I think there's not so much continuity. Maybe the approach is similar. So, we had the pandemic, we had all this talk about like the heroes, the health system, and we could see the deficiency of the state's response to the pandemic, that the state is just not able to deal with a complex social crisis, given that all these kind of different elements that would be necessary to cooperate to build a response from, let's say, just, offices of statistics, the science sector, the pharmaceutical companies, nurses, doctors, people like me who are just kind of mainly hands-on with patients who, have very little communication with doctors, the community, all this kind of, sometimes separate to privatization, sometimes just through very different state departments. All this is kind of a complete mess, plus the own interests of the state, meaning there was no collective response really to the pandemic. And so the question was like, okay, how could the working class kind of recompose itself to come up with their own plan? That sounds really big, but I think, it became apparent that, that's some of the responsibility of workers in the so-called essential sector, is finding some answers to a social crisis. So, given the fact that the health sector is such a patchwork of different professions, the book is really more trying to kind of represent that. We've got some interviews in there with consultants, we've got like housekeepers, we've got people who are in mental health care, kind of community units. So it's a bit more of, okay, in order to come up with something like a plan, we have to go through kind of a process of struggle where these boundaries between different professions, departments are also broken down. Otherwise, we will never really create some kind of collective sense. So, I think that was the aim of the book primarily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just to add to that, I think that's a really good way of thinking of the book for people that haven't come across the NHS book. They're kind of almost at different ends of the spectrum. The Class Power book, to me, is the reflection on years of organising and what happened with that. And the NHS book is much more of a kind of politically naive book in lots of ways. It's a bit like at the beginning of this process of like, okay, like Marcus said, there's a bunch of us that work in the NHS. There's not actually much political kind of analysis of like what working in NHS means under capitalism. So let's at least start this process to kind of try and think about how us as workers together might, struggle and capitalism in the NHS. And I think Mark also alluded, I think it's kind of interesting. It's like how people see work in relation to their politics. And I think definitely there's a lot of people in the kind of broader left who work in the NHS, but who almost see their or do see their political activity as something they do external to their work. It's something that they do with like a campaigning organization, and they go on demos and stuff like that. And I think it was a kind of a little bit of an attempt to try and be like, well, actually what you do day to day is political in work. What you do in work in the NHS is like highly political. So you don't need to have this kind of like separation where you go to work and you earn your money working in NHS, and then you go and do your kind of activism as a kind of separate outside hobby.
Yeah. Another maybe parallel is where class power, we were motivated by the fact that logistics became a sector quite central for workers' struggle, given like a reconcentration process. If we see like in the 70s, you had the bigger factories, there was like the strongholds of the working class. Then with the dismantling of, bigger factories into smaller units, logistics came up. So by the 2000s, we saw, warehouses and hubs coming up as big as, assembly factories for cars, for example. And the first struggle in that sector, so especially in Italy and in the US. And I think if you look at the health sector, the difference with the health sector was that you can't really relocate work that easily. With manufacturing, you relocate it to kind of low paid, low wage countries, so to speak. With health, you can't really do that. Similarly, like with manufacturing, you can restructure through automation or kind of more intense use of machinery. With health, that is more difficult. It's not impossible, but you can speed up certain processes with pharmaceutical or surgery or whatever. That there might be like a little, time gains that can be won, but like in general, it just takes time. You can't, you don't send a patient through like a washing machine. You wash them by hand, and that just takes time, or you feed them, or you care for them. So we could see on an international level that there's also a concentration in the health sector. Like most of the new jobs in the, from the 90s onwards in the US were in care and health. You had a migration from, low wage countries to Europe or the US working in the health sector. So rather than relocating the work, you relocate the workforce. So that also meant that there was an increase in strike activity with this kind of, labor shortage on one side, but also with the pandemic, because all of a sudden you had like a sector that was under enormous stress on a global level, and also like a staff shortage. People seeing that they are so essential for society. So there's a new confidence, and that expressed itself in some strikes. I mean, in the US, there were more nurses strikes, mainly private sector, in Germany and France. So we were interested in that as well, to just see like how much of a reconfiguration is going on here. And yeah, that was maybe like, on the level, like how the sector interacts with the rest of society and the working class. There was some interest there.
Well, Giles, a moment ago, you mentioned the kind of private and political, or personal and political split that I think operates in a lot of political discourse that we tend to see maybe on mainstream media, where politics is, as you put it, sort of the thing you do outside of your work hours. Maybe afterwards you go to your local labor club, or you do your, I don't know, democratic duty by voting once every 4 or so years. But obviously this is something that we should be offering active resistance against. In many senses, politics is what happens in the interim. It's what happens not through the channels of official political representation, but it's what happens on the shop floor, or even within the walls of our own hospitals. So I wanted to know maybe how you two have, or what you two think can be done to try and overcome this divide, or how you have done so in your own organizing as well, between the personal and political, and maybe bringing politics into the workspace and getting workers to engage with the political questions that affect how they work and where they work.
I mean, I guess to go back a little bit, for me, I come from a background of kind of like ecological activism and kind of anarchist politics, and that's like like lots of kind of subsects of kind of political organizing and political activity in Britain, it kind of manifests itself and has done for decades around kind of campaigns and issues, you know, and I think that's due to the fact that the way politics has developed, and politics, like a lot of political struggles being smashed decades ago, like people are now, it's quite subcultural, it's quite counterculture, it's quite young person orientated, it often happens outside work. And I think part of that, for a short version of the story, I think a part of that is also down to a kind of a poor analysis of like capitalism and what capitalism entails. So I think part of, for me, what was inspiring about the AngryWorkers project, or part of what's really important about this type of political struggle, is that it connects the kind of centrality of like work to capitalism, and understanding how work, wage labor is fundamental to the kind of continuance of capitalism. So if you're kind of want to talk about capitalism, post-capitalism, and kind of a rupture with that mode of production, you need to fundamentally talk about work and workers and how they have the power to enact that. So I think the important thing for me is to try and kind of draw those links. So you're not going to kind of get rid of all this kind of historical activism campaigning in one fell swoop, but trying to kind of broaden this political analysis by talking to people who are involved in those campaigns. So recently there's been some comrades of Germany who made a very good film around climate change and about the kind of limitations of activism in the kind of Extinction Rebellion climate kind of activism mold. And one of the things that some people AngryWorkers have done around the country is have these film showings as a kind of way of having a discussion, the beginning of a discussion around, well, so you have this strategy of kind of ever more militant even, or ever more kind of grabbing activities, but they're always done by groups of people outside work that fundamentally come across the barrier that they don't actually wield the power in society to make these fundamental changes. So yeah, so that's a kind of one of the things that I think we do to try and kind of bridge this gap and get over it.
Yeah, I mean, that's from the one side, like maybe how we interact with the left and say like, always, the activist world, think like, let's bring the question of our own, daily survival into it, and how work and social change interacts. Now, I think there we can see like, there's a vacuum now, like this kind of Corbyn project has stalled a bit. Starmer gives the cold shoulder to the strikers and to the unions, at the same time, there's an increase of strikes. So maybe there's space now for people to really think like, okay, we can't bypass the situation. We can't just kind of capture the Labour Party and then kind of politicize the labor movement. We actually have to go through these experiences again. And we have to really analyze, these strikes that are happening increasingly, but we don't know yet, like what kind of experiences they bring with them for the workers who are involved. So maybe there's a new kind of political generation that kind of grows up in this moment that is actually, looking more into the actual experience rather than saying, okay, we take the unions as a given. They're the transmission belt for, that doesn't seem to work. So in a way, there's a vacuum, and that's a good situation. From the side of the workers, you can't be voluntaristic and say like, okay, out of 20, 30 years of very low level of class struggle in the UK, all of a sudden you start an enormous politicization process because of your collective activity. That won't happen. We can see like for the strikes of logistics workers to happen in Italy, a lot of the workers were from countries of the Arab Spring. They were influenced by that experience, and they took that confidence of opposing like police states in countries like Egypt, and they transformed that and say like, okay, we can struggle as workers as well. If we could face the army at home, we can face like a company management. And similar with the cleaners, kind of in places like UK, most of them come from kind of Latin America countries with some recent experience of struggle. You can't replace that. So in the hospital, I find there are a lot of like international workers. Some of the doctors are from like Myanmar or from Hong Kong. There might some political like politicization because of their background. All that is like a bit untapped. We don't know much. Like if you look at recent movements, also like countries like Sudan, for example, it was often like doctors or medical professionals who were like part of the democratic, movement against, military dictatorship. These kind of things might reverberate, but yeah, that would need looking into. So at the moment, I don't know, it's all a bit trial and error. Working in a hospital is not like in a warehouse or in a car factory. You are kind of, even though like in the place where I work, it's 10,000 people, that's kind of that a lot, but like people are separated by wards. They, very like small professional segments. So it needs like, various kind of attempts, like to bring some people together and see like what they think about life in general. And we came across some people who are like more active in environmental stuff. We got in touch with people who work as healthcare assistants like me, who come from Iran and had some politicization because of that fact. So it's like, we have to build like a political culture again within the workplace. I mean, it's partly about the day-to-day struggle, but it's also about like, talking about the social crisis and seeing what kind of, comrades you find. But I think, yeah, you have to put yourself out there in order to find them,
Yeah, and that's a far more like kind of orientating ourselves towards the people we work with and the people we live around is much more the kind of orientation, rather than like kind of comment about kind of other small political sects or organizations.
Well, I guess there are a couple of follow-up questions to what you two have just said that come to mind, but here's one to just start us off with then. I briefly worked in the NHS a couple years ago as well as a healthcare assistant down here in the Southwest. And to be honest, I was at the time really inspired by the work that you were doing as well. So I tried to have these conversations with my colleagues in the hospital about like the politics that was happening around us at the time. And something that I noticed was that there's almost this class divide within the NHS as well. Maybe this was just because of the specific hospital that I was working in, but there were, for example, the doctors at the top who seemed totally untouchable and absolutely aloof. And then there seemed to be this lower strata of, the nurses who have representation through the Royal College of Nursing and who seem to be quite wary about raising their voices against their employers and against the malpractice or against the indignities that they suffer at work. And then in the very lowest stratum of the NHS, there are, of course, us, the healthcare assistants. And I always found the most success talking about politics to the healthcare assistants, to friends who were working on my ward from the Philippines, from Jamaica. It seemed like they were always the ones who were the most willing to speak up against things like the failure to keep up with the rate of inflation and pay, or even racism that continues to be extremely prominent in the NHS. I was wondering if you had any similar experiences, obviously without, naming names or going into too much detail, but if you found that there were any trends in who was willing to engage with the politics that you were trying to bring to the NHS, where you had successes and why.
Do you want to speak, Mark?
I don't know. I'm from reading Jonathan Neal? Yeah, his book on the NHS in the 80s. I'm remembering a bit like back in the days how like hospital kind of were organized. I think maybe the class differences have kind of diminished a teeny bit, like in the sense of more international kind of doctors come in who often say like, oh, where I worked before, for example, in India or even like in the Philippines, a doctor wouldn't even talk to a nurse. So, I think this kind of stark separation, the doctors are definitely, coming from an upper class background and the nurses come from whatever. I think that has, maybe not change from the sociological sense, but like inside the workplace, I think doctors are forced to cooperate a bit more, to communicate a bit more. With the nurses, on the other hand, it's now like a degree in things. So like there is still this factor, unlike in, for example, in Germany, it's still an apprenticeship. You get paid to do it. Here you have to pay, and then you can call yourself, a person with a degree. So maybe there's still like a kind of barrier, but in terms of being receptive to political discussion, I couldn't make such a kind of distinction necessarily between healthcare nurses and doctors. I'm not sure. I mean, I think, yeah, with the doctors, I think there was quite a critical response to various, issues recently, especially during the pandemic. It was quite, critical voices. But then the doctors, because of their position as, more like intellectual workers, they probably focus more on, changes of policies and various kind of fixes, rather than thinking, okay, we need the whole workforce and the whole experience of workers in the health sector to change something. They've got more like an engineering kind of approach to things, perhaps. Yeah, I don't know. What do you think? You more amongst skilled people there.
Yeah, I don't think I could pick out one particular professional category that were more receptive to kind of political ideas at all. I think I don't think that would be the case. I think so. I've always worked in acute medicine, which I think by its very nature is a lot less hierarchical than ward medicine. I don't know where you were, Kenny.
I was in a ward.
Yeah, and I think also some types of ward medicine, so surgery is particularly still known for being quite, the surgeon at the top, then young youth doctor, then junior doctors, and then the rest of the healthcare profession. So I do think it a little bit depends where you work in terms of the kind of hierarchical nature of the workplace. I mean, maybe it's slightly off topic. I do think there's I think you're a little bit right around kind of people working in some areas of the hospital being more likely to strike or struggle at work around their conditions, like healthcare, supporters, domestics. I think there's all sorts of things. I think part of that is just structural in terms of like some of those services, like domestic hospital workers and cleaners, are often subcontracted out. So they're often the ones that kind of just have more impetus, as it were, to kind of struggle. I think I would guess, or I would say, and probably get in trouble for it, is that there is something cultural around nursing that makes it difficult for people to imagine striking or taking political action at work because of the kind of caring nature of that profession, and then equally kind of who that then attracts. And I think that's something that's just like a little bit deeply ingrained in the nursing culture in Britain. I was talking to someone recently who's been involved in kind of some strikes and struggles in NHS hospitals down in London a while ago, and they were saying the nurses were notably the category of people that never really came out on the pickets. It was always doctors and the healthcares and everyone else, but the nurses, not they weren't necessarily supportive, but they were a lot more wary about joining in on demos and pickets. But unevidenced anecdote.
Yeah. Whereas, in Germany, the recent strikes, that was mainly nurses and apprentices. So in the US as well, I think, yeah, I mean, we had in the late 80s, early 90s, something like an international nurses movement. And there it was the contradiction was, there was also the professional pride that gave him the confidence to go on strike and to say we are skilled people. We are not unlike maybe our mothers who might have been nurses and were these kind of good people, carers and all that. We are workers, but we are skilled workers, and we want a clear line between our profession and unskilled people. So that was somewhat, at least in France and Germany, and also to a certain degree in the UK, that was on one hand the confident element. We are skilled workers. We can struggle on that basis, but also a professional division. So I don't know if it's we're in similar condition with this current pay campaign, for example. But I think it's quite broad. I think, there might be a chance that, it's not unless it's just the RCN that goes on strike, we are currently balloting in unison. If it's just RCN, then it might turn into nurses. But, if the other unions get over the threshold, then hopefully it will turn into more like a sectorial kind of thing. The other element maybe of political questions is who is actually witnessing the social crisis inside or filtered in the hospital. And like, it often seems, to me at least, that we have a lot of patients that are like medically fit. They could go home theoretically, but like they can't because like, there's no community care. Their families are messed up. There's a high danger that they become homeless or that they've got like, other major problems. So you're constantly dealing, apart from the medical side, which the doctors might see, the nurses and healthcare systems and some of the, people like physios, they really see the social dimension of sickness, basically. So they see that a lot of ailment is produced because of the social background. I work on a respiratory ward, and you can see how many plasterers and truck drivers and people with working class kind of lives end up with chronic lung problems. But you also see the fact that they are in hospital half of the time because they've got nowhere to go. They live in small shitty places where they can't look after themselves, and there's no social care. So this kind of politicizing effect, I think that is not everyone sees that. There's some I think healthcare workers, nurses see it more than the doctors, but also maybe more than the domestics. So this specific quality of work that hopefully will express itself once the strike is happening. If we look in there, I think we can draw a parallel maybe to the strikes of teachers in Chicago, for example, who knew that while they were on strike, the school kids wouldn't get their lunch. They know how many working class kids are in that area. And they knew, okay, we've got a social responsibility here. If we go on strike, these working class communities definitely suffer, and we should address that. And I think, any kind of developed strike in a health sector would have to do something similar.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess just to like contribute anecdotally, while I was a worker, a strike was declared by one of the major unions. I was just a bank healthcare assistant, although I really only worked in one ward for the time that I was doing it. And I can't remember which union. I think it might have been the GM something. But I remember like walking around my ward, asking my colleagues if they were planning on joining the strike. And many of them, like even members of the union, said that they just hadn't heard of it, that it hadn't been included in the union's weekly newsletter for some reason. But I think I want to ask you about what unique difficulties there are to organizing in the NHS. I think, as you mentioned earlier, there is this almost rhetorical fodder, which is a lot easier to throw at strikes in the NHS, calling them like reckless and irresponsible. You always see it being said that people's lives are at stake, so the nurses can't possibly go on strike. But then you also see the exact same comments being made on the recent RMT strike, the rail strikes, saying people need to go to their jobs so they can afford to feed their families and so on. So I think that way of trying to criticize strike action is pretty universal. You can use it to attack a lot of different industrial action. But what is it that makes organizing in the NHS or in a healthcare system especially difficult? I really feel that there's something there, but it's sometimes hard to articulate.
I'll say a couple of brief things. That's all right. So I guess the first one is just a practical problem around kind of divisions within the sector. So there's kind of, like Mark said, this kind of division between health and social care is like, even though they're kind of inextricably linked up, there is like a practical difference around the workplaces and around all sorts of things to do with that. So there's divisions between that, divisions between kind of workers and patients. There's kind of professional divisions around how people are divided up into quite specialized clinical and non-clinical areas. There are enormous, confusing, difficult places to find your way around. Lots of people that work in a bit of a hospital will not know their way around another bit, especially in a large hospital. So people are divided into wards and areas, shifts. So it's shift work, which makes it quite difficult. I've worked in the same place now for 7 or 8 months on shift, and it's a 24/7 department. And often I cannot see the same person. I can see someone and then not see them for 2 weeks or even longer if they've had a holiday, just because of the way the shift pattern works. So I think there's those kind of like pragmatic or practical differences. I mean, there's a whole question of unions and their problems with them that Marco might talk about. And I guess the other thing is Marco also mentioned, it's the difference between working somewhere where you produce a product of value at the end and working in health where you're not producing a product of value at the end. So the impact of any action you take at work is not immediately depriving the business owner of profit or the ability to produce products. It's much more of a system of you're kind of reproducing healthy workers for capitalists, but also for their own benefit. So it's the kind of the immediate impact of the strike is a lot harder to kind of talk about in simple terms.
Mhm.
So that would be my two kind of short points on that.
Yeah, definitely. I think you said the main things. Maybe addition to that, like NHS is more like from the left and from the unions. I mean, it's nice that they say it's our NHS and all that, because compared to maybe our system like in the US, there's something to defend in terms of like free, most of the time free healthcare provisions, but it's not really our NHS from a worker's point of view. I mean, we have very little control over how the work is organized and all that, but it's kind of, it seems to stop the unions also to mobilize within the NHS, because how can you on one hand defend something and the other hand then say like, yeah, but we're going to strike against you. So who's the you then? Is it just the government or whatever? So there's that. Then the fact that, now we've got a pay campaign, it has to happen on the national level because it's wages are defined on the national level. So like to run a national ballot is like something that, you need like a big bureaucratic apparatus basically, and the unions push that line and they say like, yeah, we have to get it over the threshold on a national scale. Whereas if you look at each trust, they can pay more depending on, for example, recruitment and retention bonuses. So like our trust, the management can decide at the moment that we give the midwives, let's say 400 quid bonus a month if they work 4 more shifts overtime, and they get an extra bonus because we can't recruit or retain them. So the unions could also on a trust level say, we want a recruitment and retention bonus, for everyone, because, so it's theoretically they could go on industrial action over that point. But that's they don't want to do that for various reasons. The unions themselves, we've got like 7 different unions in the trust, in the hospital. We've got a joint union council, but it's really difficult to just move them to say like, yeah, we do a joint. There's a lot of competition between the different unions. Each union has got different constitutions. We see that initially all unions said we agree to a similar demand in this pay round, which is like pay increase to the inflation level. Then RCN pulled out of that. And now we've seen that, Unison in Scotland, they were in the process of an industrial ballot. Now they stopped it from the headquarters because the government came with a better offer. So like on many levels, the current representation in terms of trade union representation it's not very, it's as bureaucratic as the NHS somehow. It's kind of mirroring the bureaucratic structure of the NHS, and that makes it difficult to organize. I mean, I've been a union rep now in the hospital for just about 1.5 years, and it's just like you bang your head against the wall.
Now, you've mentioned a couple times now your criticisms of the union system, but one of the things I've noticed reading both the literature that your group has been producing and the literature that other groups have been producing about you is that one of the things you're probably the most often accused of is syndicalism, or like anarcho-syndicalism or something like that. And it seems like that's almost certainly not the case, or not a fair descriptor of your group. You seem to be quite critical of the unions. So I was wondering, what do you make of that label? What do you make of syndicalism? And given the criticism that you do have of the union system, what value do you think there is in continuing to engage with it?
I mean, maybe we can both have a bit of a go at that. I mean, for me, I'll just speak about my workplace. So I think the reality is, whatever your political position on unions, and definitely I would say my position is kind of critical politically and kind of pragmatically in how they operate. I think whatever, especially in the NHS, I think whatever your position is, there is a kind of reality to struggle will in some way be mediated or controlled by the unions, and most of the workers will, at least initially, be engaged in that struggle via the unions in some way, shape, or form. So it would be very, very difficult at the current moment in time, especially as kind of an isolated one or two individuals in a hospital, to kind of engage politically and in some ways not have dealings with the unions on a day-to-day level, as critical as you want to be politically. Yeah, so that's my kind of shorter version. I'm sure Marco wants to add something.
Yeah, maybe on a tactical thing, like I became a union rep mainly in order to walk around the hospital, which you can do on your own, but like, it's basically opened some doors. You start representing people like from the kitchen, for example, where it would be really difficult to go into that kitchen and just start talking to people. No, it would be, I guess, would be possible. But like in that way, it was much easier. So, I managed to walk around places and got to know people. So just on that level, which is not very political at all. On the wider question of syndicalism, yeah, I mean, the labor law and strike laws and all these kind of things are reality. Often it takes a round of strikes that give people the confidence to kind of overcome them or to kind of push through them. But like at the current stage, I mean, you just deal with a material framework, which is the labor law, and the unions are in somehow the representation of that. This was also the limit of strikes. But yeah, the problem with syndicalism maybe in the bigger picture is that it has got this kind of idea of we gather workers around this kind of economic issue, which detaches a lot of political questions. But it's also like, if our members, for example, we organize on a hospital level, and most of our members are, let's say, nurses who have been working there for 5 years, and their demand is like, everyone who has been working there for 5 years should get an extra bonus. As a syndicalist organization, you are democratic and your members should decide. But on a political level, that kind of demand, although it has got all the rank and file support, would create further divisions. So like that, because it would create two-tier workforce or whatever. That's just like an example where you need a kind of a political wider class reference that is not just like particularly for one group that is organizing in a specific union, or even as a syndicalist rank and file union, but it has got a wider political class perspective. So I think there's something to be said about a separate political organization and the necessity of it. But yeah, otherwise we engage in the unions and try to kind of push for some rank and file activity. But now currently we see CWU calling off strikes, that is decided on the top level. RMT at various points had postponed or stopped strikes, and that's decided at the top level. So this kind of constant idea of the rank and file could theoretically have the control over the union is also a bit of like a trap. So I think the political element is to say, we propose assembly type of, or rank and file type of structure, but we push that to the limit. At the same time, we have a political discussion why we will reach that limit, and that limit will be reached by the union's own self-interest, separate from our interest, and it will be reached by the law, and we have to prepare ourselves for that. So that's somehow our line. So it's a quite like, you could say it's like a bit of an opportunist line, but you can also say it's a correct tactical line. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess just carrying on a little bit then, what I think probably introduced me to your group all those years ago was the fact that where I was studying for my undergrad, there was a lot of interest in like the theory and praxis of the Italian anti-capitalist militants from the 60s to 80s sometimes referred to as operaísmo or autonomismo, or even just workerism or autonomism. Your group is also significantly inspired by the struggles that occurred in Italy at that time. I know, Marco, you referred to a couple of them already. And if I'm understanding it rightly, you seem to also make a lot of use of their theories. I know you have a piece published on your website by Sergio, who is, one of the Italian operaistas, but you're also quite critical of other operaistas, like Antonio Negri. I was wondering if possibly you'd be able to give our listeners maybe like an introduction to what operaismo is for you guys, what use you make of it, and like its relevance to the kind of work that you do as a group.
I think it can be mainly explained out of the specific turmoil that was Italy in the 60s. I mean, it was such a rapidly developing industrial kind of center. It was like at the same time the history of like a council movement of an old workforce organized in traditional communist parties, and these kind of things completely clashed. On one hand, you had like this kind of, very Stalinist to a certain degree, but labor workers movement was this kind of history of politicization and defeat in the end, defeat by their own organization in terms of Communist Party. And you had a rapidly developing industrial working class of a new type. And these kind of things, this kind of tension created a new groups that really try to understand what is the relation between a change in the industrial organization and the process of politicization of workers and their struggles. So anyway, that's why these kind of groups that try to find new forms of struggle, like student workers assemblies, workers inquiries, political committees in factories, they evolved out of that tension in the 60s and 70s. I don't know. I think some methods are still valid. Methods like inquiry, really trying to understand what workers are already doing in terms of organizing, or like how their daily experience and cooperation can be used as a weapon. These kind of methods are still pretty valid. See like where are the leading points within a strike movement. Like if we see at the moment, we see increase of strikes, but rather than just kind of celebrating that they're all kind of strikes, to have a qualitative analysis of them and say which tendencies here within the strikes are actually kind of have a potential to generalize. These kind of things I think are still positive reference points. I don't know. I mean, this is a big question. I would say maybe currently we see like the divide. If you think like there's an increase in strikes, and at the same time we see something like don't pay, meaning like orientation towards issues like energy prices and all that. And I think if we look at the 70s, mid 70s in Italy, which was like the inflation level were like 20%, it was that from the factory committees, or like from workplace-based groups, they were using their force and their collectivity that they had in order to organize something like don't pay, but like on a wider scale, or rent freeze, or like cut of transport prices, or all kind of things that are normally seen as outside of the workplace. At the time, it was mainly these political committees in factories and bigger workplaces that took on that struggle. They occupied houses, and I think that's something that we have to look at the moment, because we have strikes that still remain quite like sectorial and like arranged around their conditions, despite all good programs like Enough is Enough. They've got all these kind of declarations, but it's not practical. It doesn't really like, R&T or CWU workers on strike are not going around and saying, okay, from now on, all buses are free, but then you've got like don't pay as something like, such a rapid kind of involvement, at least like on the, social media, WhatsApp level of people who say like, yeah, let's do something, but it seems very like ungrounded in material power. So I think that might be a reference point for us. There's an article on our website, it's kind of referring to these political committees in the mid 70s. So if people are interested, they can read more on that.
Mm-hmm. We're almost out of time, but I want to ask you one more question along this line, hopefully one that's a little bit more accessible, and specifically about the picture of the workplace that you provide. I'm reminded of one of the operaistas, either Sergio Bologna or Franco Piperno. I can never remember which. All of these names, I just get them confused. But one of the operaistas has this criticism of Antonio Negri and his idea of the multitudes, that if we try to use that as a framework to guide our organizing, it almost seems like it's impossible to link up all of these different struggles and all of these different workplaces, because it just seems too qualitatively heterogeneous to develop into like a national movement or a collaborative movement, not only between different industries, but between different workplaces. When I was asking earlier about your experiences trying to organize in the NHS, one of the things you said that stood out to me was how like the specific struggles and the specific foundations for any kind of organizing can change from hospital to hospital and even from ward to ward based on like the difference of the composition of the workers in those areas and the kinds of specific demands. How, maybe this is too big of a question, but how do we move beyond this kind of a paralyzing difference that exists between different workplaces, different industries, to try and make a collaborative movement that doesn't just end with, you know, like union actions or industrial sectoral strikes, as you keep saying, something that is capable of linking up the various different components of the working class in different regions?
I think there's a danger of just like mystifying differences a little bit too much there. Like you could get bogged down in kind of all these like technical differences around different wards and different departments and different hospitals. But fundamentally, like we all go to work, we all work in the hospital, or we work in kind of other settings. We all go to the same shops. We mostly pay the same companies for our bills. We mostly have landlords or like banks with huge mortgages. We send our kids to the same schools. We like use, you know. So actually, I think there's a danger of just mystifying difference into something that's more important than it actually is from my kind of perspective. So I think, you know, when you talk to people at work, you have far more in common wherever the workplace is, whether it's a hospital I work at or whether it's a place I go and get my lunch round the corner in a cafe. You have far more in common with people there than you do kind of mystified differences around, you know, God knows what.
Yeah, I completely agree. And there are like certain things that are in the moment that you experience in various sectors. For example, global supply chain problems. I mean, we've got a comrade who works in a caravan, a motorhome factory, and they can't get any parts from Europe or from China at the moment. Whereas in our hospital, there are no wet wipes to wipe down your patient because they come from China. We've got like, you know, various, you know, expressions of a social crisis that you feel like in most workplaces. Brexit, you know, all of a sudden you don't have enough colleagues anymore because they go back home because the pound is crap. They rather work back home in Spain, and that might happen in your restaurant or in a hospital or in a whatever kind of factory or call center. So I think the mood is something like, you know, we are understaffed wherever we are. It's crap. The wages are, you know, declining. And the whole society seems to be a bit crumbling. The political class is in completely chaos, and they want us to accept the strike laws, whereas they break any law that they want at the moment. So there's something like a mood that a class movement could express, you know, on a much wider level. The question is like, who's like a bit of a core, who's like an organizing core of that, of a potential strike movement. And I think people forget, like you mentioned, like multitudinous concepts like that. I think that's, you know, people forget the material core of reproducing society. So if we look at like in UK, you've got maybe 35 million people working, and it's still like something like 10, 12 million people who work in very basic kind of things like agriculture, transport, energy, health, basic manufacturing, you know, all these kind of, maybe education might be essential, I'm not sure. But these kind of things, you know, there is something like a rump of society where workers engage with a potential consciousness of we keep this society running. And at some point with that will come like a responsibility, because if the rest of society, because of the market form, the money form is crumbling and reproduction is in danger, I mean, there's a question of, you know, transition, like how do we transform this kind of fairly irrationally organized kind of system into something, you know, more sustainable. And yeah, I think the pandemic to a certain degree politicized this fact, because people realized, okay, there is something like an essential worker. I mean, if they're not doing their job, then all of a sudden the supermarkets are empty, or the hospital can't be run. But they just saw it as a kind of moral obligation of heroes. They don't see it as a kind of let's say a social responsibility or working class to develop some kind of alternative. And I think these kind of strikes, at the moment with, transport workers, dock workers, and all these kind of things, on one hand, you can mystify them. Oh, this is the old working class, and yeah, they're back. Hey, great. But I think that would be a mistake. To see them more like, in, for example, in how do you say, like in a fusion with the environmental question, to see in these kind of the sectors where we really have to politicize the question of transition and workers' involvement in it. And there I can only emphasize that, for example, in Italy, there's a current struggle by workers of a company called GKN, actually a British company. They produced car parts for normal fossil fuel passenger cars. They occupied their factory, and they're basically trying to work on enforcing something like a green transition of their factory. So they're not waiting for some kind of Green New Deal, but actually taking on that responsibility, saying like, our factory was like a part of a social productive fabric, and this is how we see it. We're not like just defending our jobs because they were paid, but we are a part of a community. We have got productive knowledge, and we want to use that in the best ability for the community. So these kind of struggles, they might emerge now with coming recessions, with kind of people becoming more aware of just like the destructive nature of work. And I think as political collectives, we have to kind of learn from all these kind of facets and bring it back into these strikes. That's our, rather than just standing there with the flag, say, yeah, support, seeing what are the political elements, what are the advanced points, and support them.
Mm-hmm. Well, if we had more time, I'd have loved to ask you about maybe Marx's theory of the general intellect, because I think that's maybe somewhere in the background there, but I think we're really just about out of time. So I was wondering if, in closing, you wanted to make any comments for our audience, or maybe if you wanted to tell us a little about like the work that you're currently doing as a group, or anything that you might have coming up.
No, I'd just plug the book, actually. If anyone would like to get a copy, they can order it from PM Press in the UK. I think it's a tenner, maybe including postage. And we tend to kind of kick around at various book fairs and political events, doing stalls and chatting if people want to meet us. Or if you're a healthcare worker, especially, you can contact us. That'd be really great. We can have a chat.
Yeah, and we just try to do more interviews with people who have been involved in current strikes. There's a pretty good interview, I think, with a railway worker, actually like a London tube driver, looking at the inner life of these strikes and the experience. So yeah, if you had a strike experience recently, if you want to kind of talk to us and have a good conversation, get in touch, that would be great as well. Or if you're interested in general to work with us, that would be cool. Yeah, I would say that's it.
Now, is there a link or anything on your website that people can follow if they want to get in touch with you, or is your email address on there?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, there must be the email somewhere.
Right. I'll be sure to put that in the video description then.
Yeah, definitely. Just get in touch. We're quite friendly most of the time, and it would be good to meet. Yeah, but yeah,
Right, well,
thanks for talking to us.
Yep. Thank you so much for joining me today. This has been Angry Workers. See you around.